I often have little debates with myself as to the direction the teaching could take. And in the end, the debates tend to always fall out because I come to the conclusion that I can't really decide this ahead of time and come up with this is how it's going to be. But to fill you in, the debate often is about three different approaches. One is an approach where an emphasis on the ending of thinking or stepping out of thinking and just recognizing ourselves prior to thought. And that, I guess, is what a lot of what I call the awakening teachings, or what I call the top-down teachings, are focusing on. And the emphasis in those teachings is to break the habit of thinking logically, thinking in terms of causality, relating to oneself as a physical entity, relating to life as an objective reality. And so in those teachings, a lot of statements are made about the nature of self, about the nature of life, that are quite radical in an ultimate sense, or if I were to summarize general sense, it's almost saying life, the universe is not real, that things are not at all as they appear, that time and space doesn't exist, that causality doesn't exist, that you are not a person, you're not a human being. And that to me is completely appropriate as a teaching, and I can see from certain angles how that is also accurate, and you could say true, depending on how we use the word true. So accurate from a certain perspective, absolutely valid as a teaching. Teachings really are there not necessarily to tell us how life is in an absolute sense, but rather to bring about required changes. So that is a very valid teaching process that I'm familiar with. There are all sorts of teachings that are valid. I mean, going back all the way to teachings that tell you how to do things, how you should live, be good and don't be bad. That's appropriate for a group of people that require that type of new conditioning to bring them to another point, to bring about a required change, and then something else will come in and that will be appropriate. I never found myself seeking in that way. The seeking kicked in at a very specific point on the seeking spectrum, I guess you could say, and I found myself involved in esoteric top-down non-duality teachings. So that's in terms of what I consider putting forward as a teaching, always fits into the realm of where my seeking took place. Because that's what one knows intimately. That's what one knows beyond concept or beyond something that is learnt or told in a book, but rather, hopefully, one is talking about what actually happened, what one knows as a process, and can see, those concepts as being just the initiators of a process of thinking and seeing, and therefore bringing about change. And so when teachings are put forward, if you're talking from your own experience, then they tend to have the most power. So that's one approach that I think is extremely important within this journey towards liberation. To come to see oneself and life radically different, primarily that is to get us to see the difference between our thinking and what we can call what is. And our thinking and what is, as part of our human development, tend to be essentially blended. And our experience of ourself and life is not such that our thinking is seen as a specific layer of the experience. The experience and the thinking are essentially merged, and something fairly radical needs to happen in order for that separation, you could call a separation of the layer of thinking and the experience of life. Something fairly significant needs to happen there. And I contend that if that separation doesn't happen, then any change that happens within a layer or a dimension of knowing ourselves that is not the dimension of freedom. So certain changes could still happen when the thinking and our experience of life are enmeshed and essentially merged. So when that's the case, changes can happen, but they won't be changes that are changes that will deliver freedom. In order for freedom to be delivered, or for it to arise, first a significant shift, a particular significant change needs to happen. And that change is where there is a recognition of the power of thought to affect the experience that we have of life and ourself. And there needs to be a pointing outside, pointing to a dimension outside of that dimension of merged thought and circumstance, where circumstance and our thinking about circumstance are absolutely merged. And if that won't happen unless some very specific pointings, some very specific teachings are delivered. And they tend to be what we would consider, and what bystanders, people listening, would consider to be very extreme. And in fact, they would be heard, and as they're delivered in their extreme sense, they can be identified by, let's say, someone who is using good critical thinking as being not true. And that assessment by someone who is capable of fairly good critical thinking is accurate, because the teachings that are required to shift us into out of a certain configuration need to be quite extreme, and what they say is what's needed to be said. It's not that it's a lie, but it's not something that definitely some of the things that are said are not confirmable, and yet it's important for us to hear them and maybe even believe them for a period of time in order for a shift to happen. So all of this, I have a point in today's satsang. So I'll introduce here a saying, a Zen saying, that I think is very appropriate for us to keep in mind in seeking. And that is that, so before the process of enlightenment, mountains and rivers were seen as real, or mountains and rivers were real. During the process of enlightenment or liberations, mountains and rivers were seen to be unreal. And after liberation or enlightenment, mountains and rivers were real again. So these proverbs, these sayings, are there to act as pointers to get us to ask, so why is this said? What is it trying to point out? So another one, just to make the point about how the proverbs are there to get us to think. So when we hear a proverb, if we don't understand it, we should ask, what is it trying to say? And if we do sort of understand it, we should, or even if we don't understand it, or we don't believe it, maybe we understand it, but we don't think it's that significant. It's important to understand if it has become a proverb, it is important, it is significant, it is something that we need to be able to understand and explain. Even if we've gone past it as a realization, we should be able to know why it is important and in which context, understanding the principle that runs through the core of that proverb, why it's important. So another one, for example, is if a tree falls in a forest, but there is nobody there to hear it, does the tree make a sound when it falls? If a tree falls in the forest and there is no one there to observe it or to hear it, does it make a sound? So one of the themes that you can get out of that last proverb is the suggestion that maybe life doesn't exist, or at least life experience, the experience we have, doesn't exist independent of consciousness. One of the answers to that question is, if there is no one there to observe it, does the tree exist? Not only does it make a sound, does the tree fall? Is there a tree to fall? Anyway, the point of that wasn't to so much go into the meaning of that proverb, but it's to show that there are these proverbs that we might not have thought about, we might not think that important, we might not understand, but they're there because they're stemming out of an understanding or a part of an understanding that is very important. So get turned into a proverb so that people remember them and think about them. So this other proverb, which is before enlightenment, mountains and rivers were real. During the process of enlightenment, mountains and rivers were unreal. After enlightenment, mountains and rivers were real again. What it's suggesting is there are phases. We have another proverb that everyone's heard, more or less everyone. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. It doesn't say anything about during enlightenment there. Maybe it's during enlightenment, I have no interest in chopping wood and carrying water because I don't think I exist. But we don't need to add that in. But once again, they're not that proverb is not exactly the same as the other. But it's sort of saying not much changes before and after. And the proverb I brought in about the mountains and rivers is they start off with mountains and rivers being real, end up with the mountains and rivers being real, and in that one there's a middle phase where mountains and rivers were seen to be unreal. So maybe when originally mountains and rivers were seen as real, then something happened where they were seen as unreal, and then we get into another phase where they're seen as real again. Maybe it's not exactly the same seeing them as real as before the process. But nonetheless, it does say they were seen as real again. It doesn't bring in a distinction. Now, there is a distinction, but let's not get too carried away with what the distinction is. Sometimes what we imagine the distinction is more than maybe what the proverb would say the distinction is between the mountains being seen as real before the process and after the process. So clearly, this middle phase does something. It has to have an effect, and if it has an effect, then there's a consequence to it. But what is important is it's showing that there is a phase after a phase. Well, it's really telling us there are phases. Now, there's another proverb in the scriptures, in the Indian scriptures, that says, don't mistake knowledge for understanding, don't mistake understanding for awakening, and don't mistake awakening for liberation. So once again, it shows a progression, and each of those different stages essentially are denoted by don't mistake knowledge for understanding, don't mistake understanding for awakening, don't mistake awakening for liberation. Now, we could hear them and just say, oh, well, they're just four different things that coexist, and we just have to be clear about each one. So information, understanding, awakening, and liberation. Whereas I'm suggesting that they are sequential, not necessarily completely linear, sequential, but we could say sequential phases. There's another. The four noble truths. They too describe progress, essentially, on the spiritual path. Not personal progress, the achievement of an individual, look what I have done, I have progressed, but a description of a process of change that we get ushered through. So the first noble truth, life is suffering. So that's a bit like stage one of Alcoholics Anonymous, where you just go in there, and if you're not, I don't really know the 12 steps, but from what I've gleaned, if you can't even say, I'm an alcoholic, my name is Tom and I'm an alcoholic. If you can't do that, you're not really even at step one. And so the first noble truth is the realization life is suffering. And then the second noble truth is understanding that there is a way out of suffering. And then knowing the way out of suffering, which is where we start to learn the causes of suffering and how life needs to be seen in order for those causes to dissolve, and so on. So once again, it shows us a progression. So my whole point here is that when I'm giving, within the teaching, I often debate, okay, so which path, what is the focus? Because I think teaching with focus, a teaching that has focus, is powerful because it's repetitive and it comes at the situation from one angle and it sticks to that, and it deals with one major obstacle, or an obstacle that exists at one particular point of the process. And so sometimes I think, okay, so let's pick one. You have, as I said, the awakening, which really means a shifting outside of thought, outside of the dimension of thought. Then there is the approach of describing in terms of conceptual, in conceptual form, what we're looking for, happiness, that we're looking for happiness for the human being, that for all intents and purposes in practical daily living, we live as the human being, and so therefore we are the human being. That in practical terms, causality is the way life unfolds. There are consequences, and pointing out that happiness is something very particular, that it's not to be found in outcomes, that happiness in fact is peace of mind, and peace of mind is always attitudinal to circumstance, and explaining that it's the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome, which is our attitude to circumstance, which essentially has this effect of merging the thinking and the circumstance, because there is involvement. Attachment means high investment, feeling defined, feeling that who I am is defined by what happens. So there is a describing of all of that in conceptual terms that hopefully become part of our new conditioning, part of our up-to-date conditioning. So become part of our up-to-date conditioning because new conditioning with those concepts is delivered. And then certain thinking happens based on a new structure, on a new up-to-date conditioning. And that thinking then can deliver some insights and conclusions, and that feeds back as new conditioning, which changes our up-to-date conditioning, and the process goes on and on and on. However, when that teaching is delivered, it is delivered in logical conceptual form that describes more or less integrated living. It's very useful at bringing an integration from the point of having had various awakenings to the fact that mountains and rivers are not real again. But if you carry on looking at mountains and rivers as unreal, then and the teaching doesn't come in and say, hey, yes, that's great that that shift has happened and that you now know yourself as awareness, aware of everything that's happening, and you aren't identified with the body, and you're not convinced, you're no longer habituated to the idea that happiness is to be found in circumstance, because you are you're knowing yourself sort of freer than when there was identification with the body, and knowing the core of yourself, or knowing yourself as awareness, delivers a self-fulfilling contentment that is not dependent on circumstance outcomes, and that becomes sort of starts to set in as a knowing. And it might seem like that's all that's required. Let's just rest there more and more and more. And if we rest there more and more and more, eventually the process will be complete. Whereas, as I see it, if you rest in the nothing more and more and more, sometimes the new conditioning that is very helpful at dissolving some of the deeply ingrained beliefs that still exist once that shift has happened, don't ever come in a powerful enough way for those deeply ingrained beliefs to get dissolved. And so in that case, you have people that can be dissociating from an embodied way of living. There can be some deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome that exist in the body, although there is this capacity to shift out of it, that circumstance often triggers those attachments, and then the witnessing ceases and the suffering is felt. And so there's a lot of flip-flopping in that phase. And the flip-flopping, in my opinion, is something that will diminish as the understanding becomes more complete. And the understanding is not simply I am nothing, or I am awareness, and that all of this is unreal. But there's another side to that, which is, but in practical terms, I have to live my life as if I'm the human being in this world of form and cause and effect. And to the extent that we continue to just hold, I am not a human being, I am formless awareness, and none of this is real, we're unfortunately missing one side of a two-sided coin. And that means that the understanding isn't complete. One side of the understanding might be very well understood, but there might be a denial of, for example, the fact, but in practical terms, even if this is a dream, even if life is fundamentally unreal seen from one perspective, still the realization of that doesn't propel you out of the dream. The realization doesn't bring the dream to an end. And in fact, at some point we have to say, who am I kidding? In practical terms, until the body dies, even if it is a dream, I have to live life as this human being. And I have to relate to the table as if it is real. And in practice, it is real because it holds my plate and my cup and my knife and fork. And the door is real because I can't walk through it. I have to open it. So in practical terms, we realize all of these things that are seen to be unreal need to be held in a way where this notion that everything is unreal, which is not just a belief, it's actually something that is experientially known. There is a shift in the experience that reveals how, from a particular perspective, which it does, when it reveals this, it doesn't say from a particular perspective. When it reveals it, it seems to say, this is the truth, and nothing else is true. So that then creates the impression that there isn't a paradox that has to be integrated. And yet there is. And eventually it will feel so uncomfortable holding just that one side of the truth that at a certain point in time, hearing something like what I'm saying now will be, this is what I needed. I knew something was missing. So I have a great utmost respect for the teaching, which is the teaching Ramesh used to put forward, which is the teaching I put forward most of the time, which is talking about life seen differently, seen as a happening and not my doing, seen as if I am an expression of life, that I have been created by life, that I have been designed in terms of the blueprint, the genetic structure, designed by life, started to grow and continually impacted by new conditioning delivered in life, which that combination of genes and up-to-date conditioning produces me in each moment, or produces Roger as Roger is. And that teaching is a wonderful teaching that integrates and allows a coming back down from the realization that what I am is formless awareness into the body, keeping in mind that actually the goal of this process is not to know life as a oneness experience. The goal is not to know yourself as formless awareness, but in practical terms, the culmination of the search, the culmination of the spiritual journey is to deliver a very practical outcome. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point to sort of know the truth if that doesn't have a significant consequence? We might think that I'm looking for truth just because, well, truth must be worth having or worth seeking for. But why? And at some point, if truth didn't deliver something practical, it wouldn't be worth seeking. And the reason that truth, let's say, is sought is because it does deliver something very practical. It delivers the end of suffering. And so at some point, our seeking can start to be focused on a seeking that is now looking for this practical result, the end of suffering, rather than being obsessed with seeking to know oneself as what is described, what we're described as in the awakening teachings. We're described as awareness or consciousness, and that is said to be truth, and everything else is said to be illusion. And so in that phase, we're not looking for peace of mind, we're looking for the truth of what we are. And life is described as oneness and not separation. Separation is described as the illusion. And oneness is the truth. And so that's what the seeking is about at that phase. That's what the new conditioning has made it about. And it's very valid for that phase, because what it does is it removes us from practical daily living and trying to find a practical solution, which you might say, well, but didn't you say that what needs to be delivered needs to be practical, otherwise what's the point? And I say, yes, but we have to put the horse before the cart. rather than the other way around. So those teachings are very powerful because they aren't focusing on the micro aspects. They're not focusing on the bottom-down approach, which looks at all of the interconnectivity of things. In fact, it's saying, no, that's the realm of illusion. Take a big picture view and don't worry about thinking, because all of your thinking is based on your assumption that life is causality, that form is real, that the other is real, that you're real, that time is real. And so if you keep thinking that way, you are just going to keep the false idea of life, the false idea of yourself in place. And so the top-down teachings that aren't focusing on a practical outcome, they will, essentially will be looking for oneness, will be looking for enlightenment, which are very abstract goals. And that's good. Abstract is good when you're not, when the teaching is trying to, or the methodology is trying to get you to stop thinking. The more abstract something is, the better it is. If it's not abstract, if it's concrete, then you can think about it. And if you think about something that's concrete, the thinking makes sense. And if the thinking makes sense, we keep doing it. So the more abstract something is, and the more we're told to that thinking is the problem, then the more chance there is for there to be a quietening down of the thinking. Now, for many of you, you would have heard me say and bring out this difference in the teaching where there are all the descriptions given. And one of the very important distinctions is the difference between the thinking mind and the working mind. And why the thinking mind and the working mind come into the picture is because we describe that what we're really looking for is peace of mind, and peace of mind is the end of suffering. And often there is a notion, which is valid for a preceding phase, that enlightenment is about the end of thinking. And that all thinking is the problem. And at some point, these beliefs need to be corrected so that they're more accurate. And so if we're looking for the end of suffering, it makes sense to see what is suffering. And it turns out that not all thinking is suffering. There is a whole range of functional thinking that doesn't fit into the category of suffering. And so this distinction of the difference between the working mind and the thinking mind is made. And the working mind is described as functional thinking, which is not suffering, and it doesn't end. If the working mind came to an end, if the functional thinking came to an end, we simply wouldn't move in life. We wouldn't be able to function on so many levels that we need to function even after liberation. So the emphasis on, let's look at what the thinking mind thinking is. Let's look at what the suffering thinking is. And it's described that the suffering thinking stems from the psychological me identity that has been put in place. And this psychological me is based on the deeply ingrained belief that I am a separate, independent entity that has complete control and orchestrates all of its thoughts and its actions and its feelings and its emotions, and is in control of that, is in control of how it shows up in life in each moment. And that identity is a psychological interpretation or a psychological attitude to what, more accurately speaking, is the functioning of a biological instrument. So the human being is a very complex biological instrument functioning a particular way. And this belief in personal doership says, well, I'm not a biological instrument. What I am is the one in charge of whatever I do. And I don't function essentially automatically given a particular circumstance. So that's the attitude of the me, which is often referred to as the ego. Not in this teaching. The ego is described as something different in this teaching, but traditionally, and in other teachings, the word ego usually means the belief that I am in control and orchestrating things, and then all of the ego functions based on that assumption of being in control and being better than, seeing oneself as better than the other because of one's own achievements and one's own effort. And that then means I can judge the other as not being as good because they're not working hard enough or whatever. Together with that belief in doership, there is a belief that my completeness and my happiness, my contentment, one day will be found when I've finally put all the pieces in the right place, when I've worked hard enough and when I've controlled life such that it is ideal. So that's a teaching that I have a huge respect for, because what it does is it brings the awakening teaching down to the level of practical daily living, which is where we have to continue to live our life. And it allows us to see the doership and the attachment from this place of having had a shift where thinking has separated from the experience. That's what happens in the teachings that encourage the stopping of thinking. So I was just now talking about how in the teaching that describes practical daily living, we create a distinction between the working mind and the thinking mind. And it's the thinking mind that causes suffering. It's the thinking mind that is based on the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And it creates the guilt, the blame, the pride, the worry, and the expectation, all of which become habitual, continuous, and relentless. And it becomes a blanket, essentially, that pervades, or a thread, and not a thin thread, a all-pervading thread of uncomfortableness, which becomes how we know our life experience. Now, the earlier teachings that describe things in more abstract terms are encouraging the ending of thinking. So you can see that there are two very valid teachings. One describes things more concretely, but at the same time also undermines the thread of suffering by describing the core of suffering as being doership and attachment to outcome, and explaining why, and allowing us to hopefully see why we are not the doer and why our happiness isn't to be found in outcome. Not only why, but to experience it, but for those words, those descriptions to feel personal or rather, I don't mean personal, but for them to have somewhere to land, for there to be a frame of reference within our own experience, often first there needs to have been a separation of where the thinking is seen as a function, which means where the thinking is seen to be a movement that can fall away, and that life can be known, the experience can be known prior to thinking. And when that click happens, which is often referred to as awakening, and it because it's such a significant shift in identity, it's often assumed to be that's what it's all about. That's liberation. That, I would say, is awakening. And remember, it is don't mistake understanding for awakening. Don't mistake awakening for liberation. So there is what happens after liberation. Oh, sorry, what happens after awakening. There's another saying, another Zen saying, that points that there are these phases. And the saying says, awakening is always spontaneous and deliverance is gradual. So the awakening moment is something that tends to happen outside of thinking. And when it happens, it feels like it has nothing to do with the intellect. It feels like it's a happening outside of time. And when it happens, it can feel like, oh, I had absolutely no idea when I was thinking about what is being described. There was no hope that was ever going to get me to what has happened, because in that thinking about it and trying to make it happen, there is the use of the intellect. And it's a shift out of the intellect that creates that separation. Now, remember, not so long ago, I was talking about the difference between the working mind and the thinking mind, saying that the working mind isn't suffering. The working mind is functional thinking, and suffering, which is what liberation is from, liberation is the end of suffering or freedom from suffering, is about the thinking mind. And so it might seem like thinking per se is not a problem. It's the thinking mind thinking that is the problem. However, in order to create that shift that I'm talking about, even the working mind thinking can be problematic and is problematic. Because the working mind thinking is functional thinking, but it still assumes a life of causality. It still assumes that I am the body. Now, that is correct. In practical terms, after awakening, in liberation, in practical terms, we have to live as if we are the human being. And for all intents and purposes, we are the human being. It's not like we're living as if, like I'm pretending to be the human being. It's not. It's that an integration into embodied living means living as if I am the human being, means coming back to being the human being. And at that point, we do see very much that the working mind still works, but the thinking mind has been annihilated. So if at the end we have the working mind functioning and no thinking mind, we might think, oh, so there's no problem with the working mind. I don't need to do anything about the working mind. The problem with that is that if we keep allowing the working mind and seeing it as not problematic, that can prevent this separation that I'm speaking about. Now, what I'm talking about as separation is a separation between that which is aware and that it is aware of. Now, there isn't a separation in actual, fundamentally, that which is aware is not separate from that which it is aware of. We start off with awareness being identified with the objects, especially the object of thought. And so when that's the case, there is a feeling that they are not two. And that feeling, that awareness and the thought and the body are one, it's not really a feeling, it's just that there is no space between them. So that's what I'm calling the feeling of identification. And if we're delivered a process, if it's destiny for us to go through a particular process and some shifts happen, especially the letting go of thinking, then what feels like a separation, a non-identification happens. And there is an awakening to a formless witnessing awareness, and the sense of self resides in that formless witnessing awareness. And the objects that are awared become clearly known to be just objects that are free of subjectivity, that are not what the subject is. Now, in our normal daily life experience, it's very clear that the table is an object, and I am not the table. However, the identification is where awareness has identified with a particular object, the body, and its feelings and its thoughts, especially its thoughts. The identification with thought is the biggest cause of ignorance and illusion. And through this methodology that I'm speaking about, the top-down teachings, a lack of interest in maintaining certain certain assumptions about life. So a lack of interest happens in maintaining certain assumptions, and then this disidentification can happen. And the disidentification feels like the awareness separates from the objects it was identified with. And then, just in the same way as when that identification is there, the body knows that the table is an object outside of itself, and that it is not the table. When this disidentification that I'm talking about happens, the body and the thoughts and the emotions are effectively seen as objects by the witnessing awareness, which is what we can say is what we truly are within the scope of that teaching. That means that the subjectivity, the subject means that which exists, that which is existence, or is I, is isness, is clearly known to be the formless awareness that is aware and not the objects it is aware of. So that's why it's called a disidentification, or a change in identity. So previously one knew oneself as the body, as the person, as the human being. And this shift happens where there's essentially a separation. And that's why it's called an awakening. It's an awakening to what we really are, which is the awareness that is aware of all of life. And then in that moment, it becomes aware of the body as an object, not as the subject. So Nisargadatta has a proverb, and it said, we start off knowing ourselves as a three-dimensional object, as a body walking through life, an objective reality of time and space. And then, in an instant, we know ourselves as the awareness in which the body and the world arise. So we start off by knowing ourselves as a body in a world of time and space, and then we awaken to our true nature as the awareness in which the body and the world arise. So a radical shift in how we know ourselves. A shift from knowing ourselves as the body to knowing ourselves as formless awareness. Now, how does that happen? It happens by a withdrawal from an affirming of life the way we have known it to be. So I didn't make it clear at the beginning. I said I had a direction that I wanted to take the satsang in, and as you may notice, I'm shifting from one of the teachings to the other of the teachings. Hopefully not to confuse people, but to show that there are phases. I've broken it down into two phases: pre-awakening and awakening, and then post-awakening. The post-awakening is deliverance. So according to the Zen saying, awakening is always spontaneous. Awakening is always spontaneous, and then deliverance is gradual. Deliverance is the deliverance of the ending of suffering, and it can take time for the vasanas and samskaras, as it's put forward in Sanskrit, to fully dissolve. And you've all heard the explanation that it's a bit like a fan that has a lot of momentum, and the power has been unplugged, but it takes some time for the fan to slow down. And it's in that phase that people will experience the flip-flopping. There might have been this awakening, and at the point of awakening, it seems like, that's it, it's all clear. There's no way I'm ever going to suffer again. It's understood, because the understanding that happens is not an intellectual understanding. It seems contained in the realization, in the awakening, in the spontaneous awakening. And there isn't any suffering in that moment. And it seems like suffering can never happen again, because what is being seen can't be unseen. And so I don't mean to be a wet blanket, but whenever anyone comes to me with, like, this is what's happened, is great, and suffering has fallen away, and I'll say, so how long has it been? And they go, 2 days or a week. I say, well, this is fantastic. It's a great sign. That means things are changing. But don't be surprised if you find yourself sort of feeling like it's all regressed and that what you've seen has been forgotten, because that's the normal process of things. And sure enough, most times, if there's another interaction, the mood, the experience has changed a week later or 3 weeks later, and there's confusion there, and that's part of the flip-flopping, and it's part of the deliverance phase. So in the same way, don't mistake understanding, and remember, all these different teachings use words differently. So don't mistake understanding for awakening. So you can understand what the teachings are saying intellectually. The awakening is where there is essentially a shift outside of time and space into the timeless, into knowing oneself as formless, where seeking for outcomes seems completely irrelevant to the formless awareness. It's like the formless awareness has no interest in outcomes. The body, on the other hand, is interested in pleasure and pain and outcomes. Formless awareness is that in which everything arises, and it's still and silent. It doesn't think. It's just aware. So its motives are radically different. It doesn't have motives of the psychological sort. It is just that in which everything is happening, which is why it's called witnessing. It's witnessing without a witnesser. There is just witnessing happening. The awareness itself is witnessing, not as awareness witnessing, but awareness and witnessing are a function. It's a verb. There is no noun. There is just witnessing of life, of the apparent creation that is arising within the formless awareness. So the awakening is spontaneous and it's outside of the intellect. So if we're at the point where this change hasn't happened, where we're still thinking and forced to, whenever life is happening, we sort of think about it. We label everything, which is subtly confirming life as we've always known it. If that's still happening, then we're encouraged to see life differently, and the teachings will give us some hints, like you are not the body, you are formless awareness. And then we might go into thinking about that. And one of the biggest hints is you're not going to know yourself through thought. Even the working mind thought. So if the aim is to find that dimension outside of the spectrum of interconnected opposites, outside of good and bad, that, the place where life is neither good nor bad, life just is, then our thinking needs to be delivered a significant blow. And those teachings do that by continually undermining any concept you have. It's like, that's not true. You keep assuming that, we might have a question like, well, where does God come from? If God created everything, where does God come from? And it's like that you, by thinking those thoughts, you bring into existence a before, you bring into existence time, you bring into existence God. It's just stop. Don't think that. That's all nonsense. That's all illusion. What you are is prior to that thinking. What you are is prior to what is happening in life. And you won't ever know that by trying to go, well, I'm that which is prior to thinking. So in part, this exploration, this talk today is inspired by, so I'll give a bit of a plug to some of the one-on-one sessions that I've been having. So this talk is inspired by a session I was having today with someone who I've had quite a few sessions with, and the benefit is that we get to pinpoint exactly where the block is. And so he brought in a proverb. He had said, that's right, he just finished reading a book by Huang Po. And one of the points that was mentioned is this point about discursive thinking. So discursive thinking is the problem. And then the follow-on was, and to think that discursive thinking is the problem is incorrect. So it can sound like discursive thinking is the problem, but discursive thinking is not the problem. Whereas if we narrow it down, it's saying discursive thinking is the problem. And so it's that concept, that is a concept that says discursive thinking is the problem. So the information has to be delivered in the form of a concept, which when it's received is going to become a thought. So someone would say, okay, so discursive thinking is the problem. And then the follow-on is, and thinking that discursive thinking is the problem is not correct. What it's getting at is that, so information has been delivered that says discursive thinking is the problem. And holding that concept is essentially discursive thinking. And we need these profound pointers to be delivered in order to short circuit our habit. So our habit is to get information, like discursive thinking is the problem. So then what happens is we say, thank you for that information. That's great. I'll put that in my sack. And that's the problem, because we get the information and then we put it in our sack and relate to it as if that is my information, which means each time we think about it, it includes in there the me that has the information and is going to use this to get to freedom. And that's just how the human has developed. The human can't, unless some changes happen, it can't not find a position on the spectrum of thought. So if it's told that action is the problem, it will then assume the solution is inaction. Or if activity is the problem, then the solution is inactivity. So it goes to the opposite. When it says this is bad, so it looks at its opposite as good. And if we say, and the opposite is bad, it's not really bad, it's the problem. So if you go from here, you're told this is the problem, and then you create the opposite as the solution, what's really being told is the solution is neither that nor its opposite. It is off the spectrum that we are so used to being on. And if we awaken to that, to the fact that we are continually knowing ourselves through a layer of thinking where we are bound to interconnected opposites. And that we might see that the information that we receive keeps the me that has information, so the me that has information is actually more information. It is a belief. It is a thought. The thought about the thought. So when we're thinking about the thought that says, for example, discursive thinking is the problem, there is the thinker. And so what the top-down teaching is trying to do is say, you need to step out. But it's not talking to the thinker to step out. It's hoping that both platforms within the realm of interconnected opposites get nullified so that there is nowhere to stand, and then we find ourselves propelled outside of thought. And the self that exists outside of thought is not the same identity as comes into existence within the spectrum of thought. As soon as and then once we find that dimension outside of thinking, which really means it's not really we find it, it's when life hits us a certain way, when the proverb is understood, and we're propelled outside of knowing life based on, let's say, I am a failure. It could be someone's narrative, I am a failure. And we say, you're not a failure, right? And in some teachings, there's a phase where, someone is so convinced that they're a failure that the teaching comes in and gives them affirmations. You are, a god or a goddess. So it counters the I am a failure with I am, divine. Now, what are you if you are neither a failure or divine? So that may require, it does require a lot of instruction that keeps hammering home this point, hammering home the point of how our thinking keeps us caught in the assumption of life being a certain way. So each time we think about something, there are a whole lot of labels in the thinking, because each word essentially is a label. Each word has a definition. And a lot of the words are definitions of objects, like a table, a chair, a light. And without us realizing, the development of language as part of our development is very much part of, remember what I had said, is that this identification with thought is where there is a merging between the life experience and the thought of the life experience, where they aren't known to be different. And we need to see the difference between what we think about life and life itself, because the two have merged, and we just assume that what I think about life is life. And so as part of our human development, we have language gets put in place, and language is essentially the capacity to string together a whole lot of words to make coherent concepts. And those words are labels for objects and actions in life. And so by default in our thinking, there is separation. So our thinking brings into existence a world of separateness. And in a world of separateness, of many objects, then time and space become essentially as real as the objects. As soon as we have separate objects that move as part of life, and we see them as moving independent of each other, it creates that whole cognition of the external world as a whole lot of separate objects moving creates time and space. And because they are seen from the perspective of cognition, of thinking in particular, then the subject is assumed to be the thinker, or the thinking includes a thinker of the thoughts. And then life is known more or less as we generally know it. And that is what leads to life as suffering, because that leads to the ingrained belief, I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And coming to see life as a happening, all of it is a singular arising in consciousness. Coming to see life in a more where separation falls away. Not so much, well, in a way, we're talking about this awakening phase, and so the separation is a different separation to the deliverance phase, or the liberated phase. In the liberated phase, I would say the separation is the falling away of the belief of non-doership, such that the objects still seem separate from you. In the awakening phase, it is about the falling away of boundaries, of seeing boundaries between objects. And believe it or not, the boundaries are seen between objects because we have language about that refer to the objects, and the language is made up of words, and words are individual words with individual definitions that relate to essentially individual objects. So our thinking, without us knowing it, is a developmental thing. Our thinking creates separation, which has a power to influence the actual experience. And so that is the world of separation in the context of the awakening phase. And when that falls away, life is seen to be one. And when life is seen to be one, the subsequent understanding that definitely needs to happen in order for the suffering to fall away, because you can see life as one and the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment can remain. So after it's all seen to be one, then we need to address the doership and attachment to outcome beliefs. So first, let's see it as one, and that means stop labeling. Stop assuming time and space are real and causality is real. Stop assuming you are a body. And allow life to be seen from prior to the body. The body is just an object, like the table or the books. And in those moments where life is allowed to be, with no labeling it as good or bad, with no labeling it as it should or this should or shouldn't be, without labeling a tree as a tree, without assuming we know where the tree came from, without assuming that the tree once was a seed, without assuming that the ears are doing the hearing or the eyes are doing the seeing. Allow life to be, which really means allow that which is to be what it is. This may start to show us the difference between what is and our labeling, our idea, our narrative about what is. And as I started in the satsang, the awakening phase is about an awakening to the difference between what is and our narrative of what is. Because prior to that awakening, our narrative of what is merges with what is inside our mind, and the two become one. And because what is merged with our narrative of what is, and the two become one, we essentially then know a hybrid of what is and our narrative of what is, which is much closer to our narrative of what is. And to know that life is, prior to any narrative we have about it. And when I talk about narrative, you might think I'm talking about a story of he did this, I can't believe he did this, it's unconscionable, he should be put in prison. I'm not even talking about that sort of, I mean, clearly that narrative is completely validating time and space and being the body and the other being the body and all of that. So that narrative is very much confirming life the way we've always known it. But even the simple narrative of labeling, which is not something we consciously go around labeling, it happens so automatically when we look at the table, we instantaneously label it. And so to be in life from time to time as almost as a meditation, where we entertain the notion that life is a dream, that life is a creation in mind, and that we are the mind, or the when I talk about mind, I'm not talking about thinking, I'm talking about awareness. The nature of mind is awareness. So to entertain the notion that life is a dream, and that what we are is the awareness that is aware of the dream that is happening. The body is just an object, just like the table or the other bodies, which are just objects. And the awareness of the dream, including the awareness of the sights and the sounds, is not happening from the point of view of the body. And knowing life as a happening, witnessing it, is never going to happen because we think that into existence. There's awareness present right here, right now, and the function of awareness is to be aware. We don't turn that on. We don't say, oh, in the meditation, in the exploration, I have to be aware. Awareness is always aware. It's like fire is hot. It is, and it isn't a doing. Heat isn't the doing of the fire. The fire is inherently hot. Awareness is inherently witnessing. And awareness can't think. Awareness can't be wise. It is just aware. So if there is any thinking, awareness can and is aware of that thinking. So some thinking, if it is thinking that is undermining the nature of life as we've previously known, it can be useful. It can happen, like the thought, time and space is not real. And after that thought has arisen, it's just a prompt. It's a prompt that is bringing us back to presence. And after it has arisen, it subsides and there's a space of silence, unless it then turns into a whole narrative about why time and space isn't real. Whereas the prompt is just there to bring us outside of thinking. Because the prompt that says time and space isn't real is, so all of your thinking is dragging you into the unreal. Because all our thinking is about time and space and getting somewhere and understanding something, which is affirming I am the body that, and I'm going to get something in time and space. One day I will understand, and all of this already exists. The understanding is the absence of all of this thinking. And it isn't an understanding where you can give an answer, write an answer in an exam. The silence, the being, the presence is the answer. It is a direct answer. So when Ramana asked the question, who am I? Which is not really, he's not asking a question, he's saying that is the central question to self-inquiry. The answer is not an answer that you can write down on paper or recite. The answer is the being that is prior to thinking, the being that is here already, always, the awareness that is already here, awareing. What it's forced to be aware of is all the thinking usually. And so, because it's forced to be aware of thinking, it is merged with the thinking. And in the times when we find ourselves throughout the day stopping and witnessing life as a happening, as a dream, not from the point of view of the person, but from beyond the person. So hopefully a shift where we come to know the whole of life and the person as arising inside what we are.